Okay, hi everybody. I'm Jon Levy. What I do professionally is I'm a human behavior expert. So that means I apply scientific research on human behavior to help companies succeed. And well, let's dive in then. Okay, so back in 2008, I was, I think, middle management somewhere. I wasn't incredibly popular, well-connected. Nobody knew me. But I was sitting in a seminar, and the seminar leader said something extraordinary that changed my life. He said, the fundamental element that defines the quality of our lives are the people we surround ourselves with and the conversations that we have with them. Now, all of us know that's true, right? Like if you hang out with criminals, you'll start committing crimes. But none of us live like it's true. None of us really say, okay, I want to be healthier and more fit, so I'm going to hang out with a group of fitness professionals, or I want to be better with my money, so I target a group of really financially successful people to include in my social circle. Statistically speaking, what we do is we hang out with the people that are near us, so whoever's in proximity. But that doesn't necessarily give us the life we want. So I went out and I looked for research to see if this is actually true, because I'm a science geek. And I came across these two guys. Have either of you ever come across Christakis and Fowler? They wrote a book called Connected. And they were really, really, really curious about the obesity epidemic. And have any of you ever heard of obesity? Yes, okay. Just checking. I know we're in America, and the answer is yes. But there are two types of epidemics. Those that are statistically significant, meaning a certain percentage of the population has something. And then the second type is your friend has a cold, they sneeze, you get a cold. It transfers through a vector. It comes from person to person. And they were curious, is obesity something that's a percentage of the population, or is it a vector? And those of you who think that it passes from person to person, raise your hand. And those of you who think that it's a percentage of the population, raise your hand. And those of you who didn't raise your hand, please raise your hand. Thank you, perfect. So the group that won was those who didn't raise their hand. And what they found was something surprising. They found that obesity passes from person to person. It turns out that if you have an obese friend, your chances of obesity increase by 45%. Your friends that don't know them, their chances increase by 25%. Their friends, who nobody else knows, is 10% increase, and 1 degree out further is 5% increased chance of obesity. And it turns out that just about everything passes through networks in that way, from happiness and satisfaction to an interest in education and so on. So I became really interested. And I sat there and I thought, and I asked myself, if the fundamental element that defines the quality of our lives are the people we surround ourselves with, how am I going to surround myself with the most extraordinary people in our culture and bring them together so that not only does it improve the quality of my life, but also the quality of their communities and hopefully, over time, the world. And I had this eureka moment. That's a drawing of me, of course. And because I sat there and I actually spent a year trying to understand what separates highly influential people from everybody else. And I modeled out what their lives are like. So I want you to think of the most influential person you know, and I want you to tell me, what is their life like? Give me some examples. Go ahead. This requires some audience participation. So all of you who are in the group that didn't raise your hand, you get to raise your hand now. Yes. It's fast-paced. Excellent. What else? Okay. Lack of sleep. What else? Okay. Maybe. Yes. Then I want to hang out with him because it'll improve the quality of my life. Anyway, so I build this entire model and I make a discovery. I discover that there are 4 things that if I want to engage with highly influential people, I need to apply them. And then once I discovered this, I came to an even more important conclusion. What am I going to do? I'm going to spend my life convincing them to cook me dinner. Right? Obviously. And what I ended up creating was a secret dining experience called the Influencers Dinner. 12 people are invited. None of them know each other. When they arrive, they're not allowed to talk about what they do or give their last name. Then they cook dinner together. And when they sit down to eat, everybody gets to guess what everybody else does. and then they find out that it's an Olympic medalist sitting across from a Nobel laureate, editor-in-chief of a major magazine sitting across from a famous television executive, one of the cast members of a major TV show sitting across from, well, you get the idea. And over the course of the next 6 years, I hosted 64 dinners for over 600 people and developed one of the most extraordinary communities you could imagine. So you'll see people like Dan Kahneman over there on the top left getting kissed by a famous British pop artist, while the editor-in-chief of a major magazine is chopping vegetables with a famous actor, and so on and so forth. And since its inception, we've managed to create millions of dollars in donations, and people have created TV shows and so on. And it's just a really wonderful community. But more important than that is, how do you guys apply it, right? So we talked about what is the life of a highly influential person like. Well, it's really, really busy. Essentially, it's oddly also predictable. If you look at their lives, they're scheduled out very intensely. They're spending most of their time either in meetings, phone calls, or transportation. They have no concept of their calendar or schedule because they have somebody else that manages it for them. Since they're so overbooked, then they have to, then they can only really focus on what's happening in the moment. And more importantly, people are constantly asking for their time, attention, money, social clout, access. So there's a constant demand on their lives. And for everything that they're not doing at work, they feel like they should be with their family. So the last thing they want is more requests and more people asking them to do something, or another fundraiser that is casino-based or themed. And it's just like completely absurd. So how do you actually battle all of this? Well, I discovered there are 4 characteristics. The first is you begin with giving. And you have to give disproportionately and without ever having an expectation for anything in return. Because everybody else is asking them for something, you need to be incredibly generous. It's really the only way that you can build trust off the start. And if any of you have ever come across Adam Grant, absolutely brilliant professor at Wharton, he did research on generosity. And he looked at between givers, takers, and matchers, people who will give when they're given, who are the most and least successful in our society. So quickly, who do you think is the least successful? Givers, raise your hand. Takers, raise your hand. And matchers, raise your hand. And the answer is givers. Givers are the least successful. And then who's the most successful? So those of you who think that it's givers, raise your hand. Those of you who think it's takers, and those of you who think that it's matchers. And the answer is givers. So it turns out that, according to Grant, givers and takers are both the most and least successful. And the difference is if you can stand up for your self-interest so that you're not being stepped all over. But fundamentally, you have to begin with giving. The second characteristic is novelty. Now, novelty is very, very important. Because their lives are oddly predictable and the same kind of events keep showing up, if you want to get noticed and connect with these people, something very different needs to be offered to create interest. And there's 2 aspects to it. The first is just to create interest so that there's something different in their lives. The second is that the brain actually functions differently within novel experiences. The midbrain does this really wild thing where it's able to notice and compare what it already knows from what it's being presented with. And floods with dopamine, which is the pleasure neurochemical, when it's highly novel. The more novel it is, the more dopamine is released, and the more we have what's called neuroplasticity. Essentially, the brain is growing connections and creating memories. But what's interesting is that not only is the experience memorable, but everything in its vicinity. So if what I smell, what I taste, if there's a brand involved. So by creating a novel experience, you become more memorable as a byproduct of everything. Next, curate. Since the most influential people in our culture are constantly surrounded by staff and fans, the opportunity to connect with people at their level is limited. And so if you can curate around yourself extraordinary people, it becomes easier to pull more extraordinary people in, especially if they come from diverse backgrounds. And the reason is that if you have two executives that do the same thing, they might compete and feel like one has to prove that they're better than the other. If you have an Olympic medalist sitting or chatting with a Nobel laureate, both can respect one another. The big issue is ever being a fan, because the moment that you're a fan of someone, then they have to act like somebody worthy of a fan, and you can never cross that chasm. Lastly, wonder. Many say it's the most desired of human emotions because it is so rare. If you actually look at the number of times people are in a state of awe in their life, you can usually count them without taking your shoes off. Awe is an incredible experience and emotion for a few reasons. First of all, it makes you feel present to the grandioseness of nature or the environment. It also makes you feel small, but not because you're being belittled. It makes you feel small because of the wonder and the audacity of everything that you're experiencing and seeing. So people end up being more generous and feeling more connected. If you can put somebody in a state of wonder, they'll never forget you. The ultimate form is something called yugen, an awareness of the universe that triggers emotional responses too deep and powerful for words. This is often described by parents the first time they hold their children. The universe kind of disappears and they're speechless. So what do we actually do about this? Well, these are the 4 characteristics, but let's look at how to actually apply it to our lives. You want to create wonder, novelty, and curiosity. Who here has ever heard of information gaps? Oh, good. Then would you like to? Anyone? All right. So for those of you who haven't heard of information gaps, most people view curiosity as a really positive thing, but the brain actually sees it more like an itch that it can't scratch. It's really annoying for it. And so certain brands have gotten really good at creating these headlines that some people call clickbait, right? You can't help but click on the article. And the way it works is that if the gap between what you know and what you're being presented with is too big, you get scared or uninterested, right? So if I were to start talking about theoretical astrophysics, there's one person here who would know what I'm talking about, but that's probably about it. And the rest of you would be bored. If I started talking about the weather today, there's no gap in the information from what you're being presented with and what you know, so it's uninteresting. So I need to present enough of a gap that it triggers curiosity. So how do we do that when we want to connect with people? Well, here's just a simple example. How are you presenting what you do? When people ask me what I do professionally, I say, I spend most of my life convincing people to cook me dinner. I've just presented them with an information gap. And this causes 2 things. One is curiosity, and 2, it contextualizes the conversation. They immediately know they're not going to have a conversation like they ever have anywhere else. So look at how you can reposition what you do. 2, you have to be really conscious when you're connecting with people if they're introverts or extroverts. It took me years, as you could tell, I'm an extrovert. It took me years to understand that there's a fundamental difference in the way that people engage with their environments. And extroverts get energy from being around people, and introverts get energy from being in either small, intimate groups or by themselves and reading. And when you want to connect, if you're an introvert, you shouldn't feel ashamed that you don't want to go and meet 200 people. Especially in American culture, there's this idealization of extroverts, but there's no real evidence that being an extrovert is better than being an introvert. It's just what you are. So in many cases, people put on personas for short periods of time, and that's how they deal with it. Whatever it is, it's natural for you. Understand that that's fine. And also, just design social experiences that are more intimate, because there's nothing wrong with creating really intimate small groups. When I was first building this community, I would walk up to people and I would embarrass myself to no end because I'd have no idea how to describe what I was doing. I literally like everything from famous celebrities to scientists that I respected. And it became very clear that if I want to have an extraordinary life, I have to have a willingness to make a fool out of myself. Oh, I'm over time, so I have to please hurry up. OK, so here's some 2 fun things, and I'll finish up. First, I'm not sure if you know this, but people will like you more if they're holding something warm than if they're holding something cold. So if you're going to want to meet somebody, meet over like a hot cup of tea rather than cold coffee, because the sensory perception is different. Lastly, and I could keep going to science, but I don't have time, make sure to end with style. And here's a simple example of why this is so important. Imagine you go on a beautiful first date, 3 hours long, you're totally infatuated with this person, and you're just at that moment where you're like, oh my God, I can't wait to see this person again, and you're about to lean in for the kiss, right? And in that moment, the person says, like looks you deep in the eyes and says, the most god-awful racist thing you've ever heard. And you are in total shock and don't know how to deal with it. If your friends were to ask you if it was a bad date or a good date, you would say it was a bad date. And that's because of something called the peak-end rule. We overvalue the peaks of an experience and how they end. So make sure to end with style, because it's disproportionately important on how people will remember you. So on that note, this is my last slide. It's an adorable. Now you guys will never forget me. It's adorable. You'll love it. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. My name is Jon Levy, and I hope that was useful to you guys. All right.